double up on some Marvel Star Wars issues. We're going to talk about 4 issues. We'll start with Annual Number 2, and all these are written by David Michelinie. Annual Number 2, Luke, Lando, and C-3PO are on a planet where they come across a statue of Han Solo, who is their great savior, and the statue has a recording capability. It's basically Han Solo talking about how this one time he saved this civilization. There's not a lot to it. For some reason, Star Wars makes for terrible annuals. This is bad. It's weird. It gives off a vibe that Han Solo was shoehorned in. This was like a partly done issue of something else, and he was they shoehorned Han in like those Chris Claremont issues. But this is David Michelinie. It's better than those Claremont issues. It's better than the Claremont annual we got for Annual Number 1, but it's bad. And I'm not going to mince my words here. I did not like this one bit. It was tedious to read. It was really long-winded. The twist with tying Luke, Lando, and 3PO in was done clearly by Lucasfilm saying you have to have them in. Because for some reason, Marvel in particular was like, we want Han Solo back. And Lucasfilm said, no, he's in Carbonite. You can't do anything with him. So they would find ways around it. Like issue 50, we have the Crimson Forever thing in the backstory with Han and Chewie dealing with it. It felt like a rehash of that. You need to stop. Sorry, Cleo is just chewing on my sweater, and it is really obnoxious and hard to concentrate. So, anyway, what would I give Annual Number 2? 2 out of 5. Not very good. It's probably Michelinie's worst issues thus far, by far. Next, now here's a weird thing. So, if you're reading this, like the Marvel omnibuses, and I'm assuming the Marvel Epic collections, Annual Number 2 comes before issue 67. In the A Long Time Ago omnibuses from Dark Horse, issue 67 goes before Annual Number 2, which I think is a mistake, because issue 67 sets up that Leia has figured out, kind of figured out where Boba Fett is. She's narrowing down the search. We're finally going to rescue Han now. After establishing the Rebel base and Luke being a pariah and all that, it's time to go after Han. Because Return of the Jedi is kind of around the corner. We have about 10 issues left before that sort of happens. So, might as well start looking for him, right? They've got it narrowed down to 3 bounty hunters. Bossk, the cyborg Dengar, which is not really accurate, and IG-88. Boba Fett allegedly betrayed one of them that was partnered with him, and so they're going to split up and take them down. But in this issue, R2-D2 goes missing, and Chewbacca, C-3PO, and a bunch of Hoojibs go in deeper into the Araba cave where the Rebel base is hidden, and they find an entity that is the negative emotions of the ancient peoples that lived there. They took all their negative emotions out, and it created an entity that kind of doomed them. And Chewbacca and C-3PO have to foil this entity of negativity. When I think of this issue, it's filler. It's filler. I kind of like that Michelinie will just bring Chewbacca into things and give Chewbacca things to do. That's nice. We hadn't had a droids-centered issue in a while. And when I say it's droids, it's not really R2-centered, which is what more like latter Star Wars would do. Actually, Star Wars not long from this, we would get the Droids comic series from Marvel, and then later Dark Horse would do another Droids comic series. So there are R2 and 3PO fans, but I mean, we've so far, since Michelinie's pretty much taken over the book, we've had one adventure of R2 and 3PO, which is kind of weird to me. because that was very good. This one just isn't. It's basically 3PO's the protagonist. The Hujibs don't really do anything except for be scared and useless. So yeah, did I thought it was okay though. It's interesting to see 3PO and Chewbacca interact with one another because they really don't ever. It's very rare when you see the two of them interact. It kind of reminded me of there's a chapter in one of the Jedi Academy books where Chewbacca and C-3PO and I think it's Kip Duran have to babysit Han's and Leia's kids. It kind of reminded me of that, and you know how hilarity would ensue with that. So yeah, it's okay. It's a 3 out of 5. Next, the next two issues, issues 68 and 69, focus on Leia and 3PO's adventures going to Mandalore to track down Dengar, where they run into another Mandalorian. Okay, we get to talk about Mandalore. And we get to discuss the elephant in the room with these issues. These issues were written long before we would ever get Tales of the Bounty Hunters and Tales from Jabba's Palace. So, and the Boba Fett's canonical backstory. With that being said, they kind of work and they kind of don't. So what's established in this is that they were Mandalorians when Palpatine established his empire and the Clone Wars took off. A bunch of Mandalorians got involved in the fight. Only 3 of them came back. Boba Fett was one of them, and these other 2 Mandalorians that are in these 2 issues were with him, and they were comrades. Some of this works. Some of it, you can argue, is a matter of perspective. Because Palpatine, the Empire, I know he calls it the Galactic Empire near the end of Revenge of the Sith, but tyranny doesn't start up immediately like that, and that wasn't George Lucas's point. It's very clear at the beginning of Attack of the Clones that Palpatine's somewhat become a tyrant. He's gotten a lot of power by the time Attack of the Clones has happened, and then once the Clone Wars establishes, you could look at it as he's already the Emperor. The Senate doesn't have a lot of control. They keep giving him emergency powers. I mean, that's Jar Jar Binks is blatantly manipulated into doing that in Attack of the Clones. You can argue that he was Emperor then. That is he was not. He didn't name himself Emperor until Revenge of the Sith, but he was a tyrant by then. That was kind of Lucas's point. And first of all, when you look at the Marvel comics and you look at like all the Clone Wars, what the Clone Wars were going to be, Luke and Leia were kids during it. That was established for a long time until the prequels became a thing and George Lucas moved the Clone Wars up. And they weren't born until after the Empire was officially established and the Jedi were all but wiped out. That's kind of where this comes from. And Boba Fett has a bunch of origins. And it's primarily because Star Wars canon, specifically with the Marvel comics, it wasn't considered canon for a long time because there's a lot of just weird things. We've talked about them. And there are more, unlike with like TCW, where TCW just blatantly ignored things, there was no established continuity when Archie Goodwin started these comics. There was none. There wasn't anything other than we concurrently with the early comics, we had Splinter in the Mind's Eye, and then we ended up with the Han Solo books and later the Lando books. And the Han Solo trilogy and Lando trilogy happened before A New Hope, but not very long before A New Hope. So we didn't have a lot of that, and then later in this sort of in the 80s period, we would get the Droids and Ewoks comics and cartoons, and then the Ewoks movies. But these aren't world building things per se, so the Clone Wars was kind of left alone, and David Michelini had to guess. I like that he brings in the term Mandalorian and Mandalore. I like the design of Mandalore being like a jungle. That's a unique kind of thing that would breed these like hardy mercenary types. They aren't called mercenaries. Probably because Marvel editorial wouldn't allow that word to be used. Stanley was kind of particular about certain verbiage you would use in comics, especially this is the early 80s. This is Frank Miller has just started changing things with like Daredevil the Man Without Fear around this time and pushing the envelope of what Marvel would allow to be acceptable in a comic book. We haven't had Punisher really take over, which really pushed the envelope of what Stan Lee would accept, because he was for the kids. That was his thing. These are children's comics first, and then adults could enjoy them second. They're all ages kind of a thing. Although they do some dark things, which you can do in children's stuff. I know modern day people cannot handle anything dark, and they claim they have trauma from children's movies in the 80s. I will joke about this as well, that like certain movies, when a parent gets unalived, like in Land Before Time, Littlefoot's mom getting unalived by Sharptooth is terrifying. But here's the thing, and these comics will do this. You don't necessarily need to hold your child's hand all the time. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You don't need to hold your kid's hand all the time. They don't need to have the Encanto. Every 5 minutes we have a baby sing along. We don't need that. The children don't need that. The children, they don't need to be horribly scared. They don't need to be watching like a Friday the 13th like slasher movie or something like that. I'm not promoting that, because I think that's also poor parenting. But I'm saying they can handle some things, and it's a balance, and it depends on the kid, sort of thing. But kids typically handle scarier or more violent things, and it's up to you as a parent to monitor that and teach. I'm sorry, this is becoming a Dr. Phil. Well, it's not Dr. Phil, because Dr. Phil ruined my generation. Single-handedly caused a bunch of moms to fearmonger that watch daytime television, and this is probably why we are the way we are now. Is that Dr. Oz fearmongering? How embarrassing. Maybe another time I'll talk about this in more depth on like a podcast or something. Why people think that they have to like really control what their kids watch. But I mean, you can't. Kids, it's not appropriate for kids to read Punisher that are pretty young, and like you're not going to get the term mercenary prey because it has negative connotations, and a kid's not going to know that verbiage per se. So they don't call them that, but they clearly were kind of soldiers for hire. And they did things. And this is the origins of the Mandalorians as to what they would become. As for Boba Fett teaming up with these other guys, because Boba Fett is a kid through Clone Wars. That's what's established by Episode 2. And then the 6 Boba Fett books written by Terry Bisson and Elizabeth Hand established what Boba Fett was doing in the Clone War. I'm not going to even get into TCW because that's way getting into the weeds, and that's not Mandalorian stuff. That's just him being a bounty hunter, essentially. Which he's kind of that's mostly what he did in the Boba Fett YA books. Starting with book 4, like the second half of them is him kind of doing bounty hunter stuff and then trying to get revenge at the end. I will be talking about these Boba Fett books sooner rather than later, so you'll get my full opinions on these at a later date. But just so you know, that's kind of how I look at those. As like he did more of that than he fighting in the Clone Wars. I mean, he was involved in 2 major battles, but he wasn't really fighting on one side or the other. He was kind of surviving. Could he have met these 2 guys that when they were young, and like they had an adventure together that we didn't hear about? Yeah. There's enough gaps within those Boba Fett YA books that this could have happened. They wouldn't have been men, though. That's the big thing. They wouldn't have been men, or even really, they would have been young teens, at the oldest. Or these guys could be older, and Boba Fett's younger than them. Although they call him their leader. And it could even be that they ran across another Jango Fett clone, and that clone helped them, and they mistook him for Boba Fett at a later date, because Boba Fett, by the end of those YA books, he's already hiding under the pseudonym of Jaster Muriel, and then the whole setting up that fake identity that is established in the 90s with him being... We've talked about this before with Tales of the Bounty Hunters, with the whole Conquer Dawn, and he was either a stormtrooper or an low-ranking Imperial officer that killed his commander. That whole story hadn't happened yet. They could have been involved in that, and like a latter offensive in that weird transitional period between the clone army and what would end up being the Imperial military. They could have been involved in that, I suppose. But I don't know. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't quite mesh right. And you'll find this if you read through these Marvel Star Wars comics and then you go read other things, especially Bantam era stuff, where we're really original trilogy centric still. The prequels haven't become a thing yet. They don't mesh well. They really don't. And even after Troy Denning really started like hammering home with Del Rey that we need to make these comics work, by that point it was they needed a whole team of the, like, aside from the holocron, to try to make everything make sense. And they should have done all of it kind of at once. I get why they wouldn't, because that's such a niche when you're trying to run a business. Only like weirdos like you and I would care about that sort of thing. I mean, they got the gist of it to work. Especially early on, it doesn't really... There isn't a whole lot of contradicting until you get to about the annual, which Abel G. Pena did his novella Skywalkers that fixes that. And I was talking with someone who has a theory that Heir to the Jedi would have explained why Luke has a lightsaber post-Empire, before he builds what will be his permanent lightsaber going forward after Return of the Jedi. The lightsaber he builds in Shadows of the Empire. Which we don't need to get into that again. Because that's not even relevant to any of the stuff these issues. There's no lightsaber issue. But it does lead to some interesting things. The other continuity thing that I argue works less than the whole Mandalorian thing is Dengar. Dengar has a character. He does. And it's established in Tales of the Bounty Hunters. And that character, out of all the things Bounty Hunter Wars gets wrong, which we'll be talking about that very soon. Dengar stays consistent to that. This doesn't feel like Dengar. It just doesn't. Um, he's more villainous and less crazy, because that was the big thing in the Dengar's tale in Tales of the Bounty Hunters. Is the Empire? He's not a cyborg per se. He was a super soldier. That they experimented on his brain and body, because he and Han Solo got in the, they were speeder racing, and Dengar crashed and quite frankly should have not survived it, but due to Imperial science did, and they made a super soldier that's not very predictable. Which is why he's a bounty hunter and not working with the Empire anymore, really. Um, this, he's more villainous. He's creeping on Leia hard, um, which is, ugh, whatever. He's a villain. Whatever. It works in the context of these comics. It's fine, but it's just so you know, if you're like a Dengar fan, there are Dengar fans. This is not the character of Dengar you're a fan of. He's out and out a villain. And this is probably, I'm just going to call it now, this is going to be a problem with the other bounty hunters that show up in these issues. They're not going to function the way that they should function, based on what's established in Tales of the Bounty Hunters. And before you go blaming Kevin J. Anderson for things, which, you know what, Kevin J. Anderson deserves some blaming for terrible decisions. Look at the Butlerian Jihad and that trilogy through Dune. That deserves all the hate it gets. But like, I'm not going to hate on Kevin J. Anderson for not incorporating these comics, especially because like it was what would become the Holocron that said these weren't canon in the 90s, and they weren't. They weren't considered canon until Legacy of the Force came out in the mid to late 2000s. They just weren't. They just were ignored, and they moved forward because these comics are weird and goofy. And I mean, even Mark Hamill makes fun of these comics. Like, one of the biggest defenders of comic books I could think of in Hollywood just thinks that these are goofy, weird stories that didn't get Star Wars. Fair enough. I don't fully agree with that opinion, but I get that he would think that, especially in the early 90s when Dark Empire was coming out. That's infinitely better than most of this. So, what would I rank issues 68 and 69? With the continuity things aside, it's a fine story of Leia liberating slaves from a slave trader. Because that's kind of becomes the crux of the two issues, and then dealing with the whole thing with Dengar. It's fine. It's a 3 out of 5. It's okay stuff. The meta of it is more interesting than the material itself. Because it's going to make your brain kind of wander while reading and be like, what is the thought process behind this, and this? And, that sort of thing. And they're worth checking out. I like these more than I liked issue 67. I like them significantly more than like that second Star Wars annual. Like I said, Star Wars annuals are kind of cursed things that don't really... We'll see with the third one if it ties into anything, but they don't typically get referenced in other Marvel Star Wars stuff. They're just a cursed thing. So anyway, have a nice day.